Hello, I am Showalter Barman, a student of English Literature, University of Gorbongo. Today, in this video, I would like to discuss about an essay, Feminist Criticism in the Wilderness, written by famous American literary critic and author Ellen Showalter. Showalter is one of the founders of feminist literary theory. Born in 1941, studied at Bryan Moore College, University of California. After that, she joined the faculty of Douglas College in 1969, where she developed women's study courses and began editing and contributing articles to books and periodicals about women's literature. Later, she taught at Princeton University and also served as television critic for People magazine and a commentator on BBC Radio. She has been recipient of Truman Capote Award for literary criticism. Officially retired in 2003, Showalter has written extensively on Victorian women writers. Now, coming back to the essay, this essay has been taken from Towards a Feminist Poetics. It was written at a time when women's studies had become a recognized discipline at American universities. The essay is divided into 6 parts. The first one is Pluralism and the Feminist Critic. Showalter begins this section of the essay mentioning Carol Helburn and Catherine Stimson, who identified 2 poles of feminist literary criticism. The first is concerned with the feminist as reader, which consider the stereotypes of women in literature and exposes how women have been characterized as sexual objects in androcentric writings. Showalter calls this mode as feminist reading or feminist critique. It depended upon male texts and interpretations, so it was not completely women-oriented or independent. One of the major contributions of Showalter towards feminist criticism is phasing the literary history of women writing. In the book Literature of Their Own, she presents 3 such phases. The first one is feminine phase, 1840 to 1880s, when women writers imitate men. The second one is the feminist, wherein women advocated minority rights and protested, expressing own feeling and sufferings in writings. And the third one is the female, 1920 to 1960, where the focus is on women's texts as opposed to merely uncovering misogyny in men's texts. Hence, she says even if we revise them by adding feminist frame of reference, we are learning nothing new. Therefore, the term gynocriticism or feminist writing comes in 1979 by Showalter, which is genuinely women-oriented, independent, and intellectually coherent. But she finds 2 obstacles. The first was the pluralism in feminist literary criticism, which means there is no one feminism but there are many. For example, Marxist feminist study class along with gender in literature, wherein black and third world feminists thought that their cultural histories have been excluded from critical work. The second obstacle in developing the common methodologies that Showalter mentions in the reluctance of many feminists to respond to the demand of this dynamics enterprise of women-centered feminist criticism by mentioning Virginia Woolf's experience of being barred from entering the university library, where she says it is unpleasant to be locked out, but it is perhaps worse to be locked in. Now coming to Showalter's 4 model of difference in criticism. Emphasizing the different factor, Ellen Showalter brings out 4 models: biological, linguistics, psychoanalytic, and cultural. Each of these models differentiates and defines women's writings and texts. She says that they occur in linear order. One incorporates the model preceding it. Biological model studies impact on sex on writings. The text is always marked by the body. This model of gender difference takes feminist critics to 2 types of theories of art, phallic and ovarian. Showalter mentioned that in Victorian era, physicians believed that due to women's different physical functions like pregnancy, menstrual cycle, they become less creative than men, and Victorian anthropologists believe that Frontal lobes of the male brain were heavier and more developed than women. Therefore, women were inferior in intelligence. If we apply these findings to literary process, then women have been condemned as less creative, and therefore they are blamed to have produced inferior literature, and the entire male literature marked by this superiority. Gynocritics reject this belief of biological inferiority of women. The belief of being homemaker or mother doesn't mean that women cannot write good literature. They are different from men, but this difference is not shameful, rather, it needs to be celebrated. The most urgent study of gynocritics believes women's autonomy over the body, and they insist that it is time to take biological difference seriously. Women's body is a great source of energy for women's writing. Her experiences based on her body are equally fulfilling, enriching, and satisfying. So it is important to study biological imagery in women's writing. This reality of physical experience in writings bring a new aspect of understanding feeling. The linguistic model raises some questions. Whether men and women use language differently, whether sex difference in language use can be theorized in terms of biology, whether women can create their own language, whether speaking, reading, and writing are all gender marked. These aspects are important for gynocritics. We have to understand how language is androcentric and how language which is created and constituted dominated by men actually trapped women. If we take some words like man, actor, God, author, etc. and analyze by some examples like when we say man is mortal, God is almighty, etc., we are told that it not only talks about men but women also, as the word man is gender neutral, but we cannot say or write woman is mortal. In another example, when we think about God, suddenly a male figure pops into our mind. It is socially conditioned in a way to imagine God only as male. In this way, throughout history, men have created rules and norms of language. What should be spoken by women have been decided by men. Women's words are less believed and they cannot decide the meaning as they are decided by men. It seems that they mean to be silent. This is called oppressor's language, and women speak as a foreign language. Hence, the task for feminist criticism is to concentrate on women's access to language. Actually, language is not insufficient to express women's consciousness, but that women have been denied full access to it. Gynocritics are in search of language which does not make them silent but loosen their tongue, because only by entering language they will enter the history. In psychoanalytic model, Showalter writes that psychoanalytically oriented feminist criticism locates a difference of women's writing in the author's psyche and is the relation of gender to the creative process. It means that being a female affects writing process. The aspects of female psyche includes biological and linguistic models of gender differences as the body shapes the psyche, but when it comes to women's psyche and women creative process, we have to see first how women is dealt in psychoanalytics. Freud's theory of sexuality is entirely focused on the possession of phallus. Man is man because he has penis, but woman hasn't, so she is inferior. Later on, Lacan regarded the phallus as the source of power in language, which treat men as the norm and women as the other. Gynocritics rejects women as passive and inferior. Showalter mentions good alternatives to Freudian psychoanalytic theory. The last model or the cultural model is very important because it incorporates the idea of sisterhood. Showalter prefers the model because the theory of culture incorporates ideas about women's body, language, and psyche, but interprets all these three in relation to the social context in which they occur. According to this concept, what women think of their bodies, what language they use, and what they think of their emotion are highly dependent upon social environment in which they live. Therefore, women's psyche is a product of culture in which she lives. Showalter means by this that how a South Asian woman thinks and expresses herself is different from how a white female thinks and expresses herself, as they belong to different cultures. So gynocritics are most interested in women's culture. In order to explain women's culture, she takes help of Ardner's diagram of relationship between the dominant group and the muted group. These two groups are shown in two intersecting circles. Much of the muted circle Y falls within the boundary of the dominant circle X. Circle X is main world, where the circle Y is women's culture. There is a crescent of circle Y which is outside the general group. This is called wild zone. This is the zone of women's culture. It stands for aspect of female lifestyle which are outside of and unlike of men. Metaphorically, it has no corresponding male space since all male consciousness within the circle of dominant structure. What is purely male have been accessible because men have written much about themselves in psychology and philosophy. But men cannot reach women's unconscious. There are aspects of women's culture completely inaccessible or incomprehensible. That is why it is called wild zone. Many critics advocated that this wild zone must be the address of genuinely women-centric criticism, women-centric criticism theory and art, so that the silence of women could be turned into expression. Showalter calls this wild zone a playful abstraction. Women writing is a part of dominant group as well as part of muted group, so it is a double voice discourse. In the essay, Showalter nowhere advocates for a separation of the female tradition from the male tradition. The focus of gynocriticism is to nurture a new feminine cultural perspective within a feminist tradition that exists at the same time of the male tradition but doesn't depend upon it. Walter's essay stresses the study of differences in women's writing. She says that creative writing can never be sexless. The gender of the writer is always reflected in the writings. So, this is my brief discussion on feminist criticism in the wilderness. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.